Minister. Good evening, everyone, colleagues. And what we want to do quickly and robustly and as best as we can is to take the reports from each group with regards to topic. And I'm going to ask the presenter, you can mention your main areas by wanting to distill one main theme from your deliberations. And then we'll have a quick 2-question or so response round robin on those, because the day is far spent, but we still want to tease out and codify some of the major issues, okay? So I'm going to ask first the enforcement group. They're monitored at the bottom, but I'm going to ask, I think, the enforcement group to report, and then we will come back and have just 2 small interventions. Is that how you're going to report?
Yes. All 4 discussions that we had were very, very good, and I think people could have stayed on talking a bit about all these issues. One of the first issues I asked people to discuss, because this question is not really the personnel issues, but really the legal issues. One was to do with the limitation period of 4 years for detection of offences against the town planning law. And generally speaking, everybody thought that 4 years was quite adequate. There was one dissenting voice amongst the 4 groups who felt that there shouldn't be any limitation period for egregious breaches of the legislation. The main controversial issue, I think, was the exercise of the chief town planner's discretion, and I should say the relevant authority, because it may or may not be the chief town planner in the new legislation. But when a complaint is made or when an offence is detected, how do you exercise that discretion, and who are you accountable for the manner in which it is exercised? And so we discussed that quite a lot in all the groups, and really nobody wants to or was arguing for taking away the discretion and making enforcement compulsory in every case, because they may be very small offences, and there's a limited amount of resources, and some judgment has to be made about what to follow up. But on the other hand, people feel that there is a measure of transparency that needs to be introduced into the process by probably making the decisions that are made, the complaints, the investigations, and the decisions open to public review. So that although the name of the complainant could be confidential, the actual processing of a complaint and the decision to make or not take enforcement action, there should be some accountability with respect to that. There was quite a bit of discussion in the various groups too about how more effective one could be about actually prosecuting the offences, and in terms of what the law says. At present, the law doesn't say anything, as is common in other laws, about officers being allowed to prosecute matters in the magistrate's court. Some people are in favour of it. There are some other people who are not in favour of putting that in the law. It is done quite often with fisheries officers, forest officers, public health officers, inspectors, pesticides inspectors, and so on. So that is a possibility of training up town planning staff to allow them, like policemen, to conduct cases in the magistrate's court. There are some points that were raised about evidence, the admissibility of some of the evidence, because proving these cases depends a lot on the detection of non-compliance, and the tools they're using now, the electronic tools, the space-based images and that sort of thing, are not necessarily admissible in a court of law as evidence. So that is something that we would also have to tackle. And there is the whole question of penalties and how to make penalties more effective in terms of the monetary value, and how to secure that against deterioration over time. And the feeling is that could possibly be put in schedules that the minister could update without going back to Parliament. And the question of demolition of buildings. So there's some issues that came up around the actual changes that could be put in the new legislation. And I will stop there. Oh, one other good idea or idea that was raised was that perhaps there could be a specialist court, and the term land court was used, that would deal just with like town planning and related types of issues, tenantries, freehold, and various other things, and take these type of matters out of the ordinary courts. So that is another idea. Of course, it would depend on whether or not such a court has enough business to have the merits of a specialist court. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alahar. Are there any interventions from the floor for what Ms. Alahar had provided us with? Any comments? I just want to raise one issue that I don't think came through with respect to actual taking of enforcement action, the physical action by the town plan department, which after the first service of the enforcement notice, and there is a general, I think it's a construct where we inform the minister that we are taking the enforcement action, and the general thought is if you do not hear back no, that the action then goes ahead. I'm wondering if that had materialized as a part of how the minister is involved in the system, or that is something that came up in your discussions that we need to look at.
Yes, there was a suggestion on one of the groups, I think, that perhaps the chief town planner, or let me say the decision maker, should have some sort of review process above them, right? Accountability in that sense, but not accountability to the complainant. The complainant will have the transparency, but perhaps some accountability within the hierarchy. That was raised in one group.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Alahar. Are there no other interventions from the head table as well? Okay. Appeals and calling system. That group, appeals and calling system, who's going to, I think Mrs. Smith is going to make the intervention, the submission.
The main themes that came out for the appeal and call-in process was transparency and efficiency, particularly as it relates to publishing of decisions made by the minister and the chairperson's reports. Timeframes for all aspects of the process was also a concern. They need to be more succinct and tighter. Disclosure of information prior to the actual hearing was also one that came through in all the groups. One of the questions asked was, should the minister only deal with the applications that have a major economic impact, rather than seeing everything within the remit of the 2 acres, over 2 acres of agricultural land and beach property. There was a concern about the capability and capacity of the planning of the Prime Minister's office to actually deal with the volume of appeals, and how would that be addressed. There was also a concern about the technical comments that were offered by officers, not given the weight that they should be given in the decision process. It was felt that the technical officers would make a recommendation and it wasn't taken on board. Another major concern was the movement from a technical hearing to a more legal forum. There were comments about how the process seems to be moving from a technical one more to a legal one, where case law has been brought to the hearings, and the officers that are dealing with it don't necessarily have the capability to deal with those issues at the hearing. But basically, that was it from the appeals and call-ins. Yeah.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Are there any interventions from the floor on the appeals and call-ins aspect? Anything that she's missed that any person want to raise? Just one quick query. Is it that the scope of the arguments have changed at Section 18 or 19 that the officer was speaking about, or that there needs to be additional capacity building probably within the public service to deal with the better arguments that persons are putting forward in these hearings? That there needs to be some capacity building. I think that's something that we need to know, because as persons who do hearings, you would agree that the scope of the arguments, as people train, will get better over time. So while a person may bring a legal argument, I guess the chief town planner side would have to produce someone to combat that. If that is the case for the hearing, that might not be that. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Development control or management? I prefer development management. I don't like the term control. Development management. Colleague Andy Gill will give that presentation. Yeah, either way, Andy, you.
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. In our group, we had over 40 points made, but only several were repeating again and again, and I'm just going to focus on those.
Yeah.
I can bend them.
Raise it, my God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the easy way.
Yeah, good. You're a bit taller.
Yeah. Very good. So the first one that came up almost every time was the e-planning system. It is vitally needed in order to speed up the process of consultation between agencies, and it is also envisaged that it will be available for the public to go and keep track of their own applications and make sure that they know exactly where they are. There was the rationalization, basically, oh, sorry, let me just reread this. My writing isn't so good. What came up was that the different requirements of town planning and building standards and EPD and the chief fire officer, quite often they add a lot of time to the consultation process, and most people were saying that they wanted to separate the planning application into separate stages, where you could get an early planning permission, but leave, for example, the building standards details to later. In other words, you would get an approval early from the chief town planner, and then you could deal with building standards later to work out the details. And for most people, that was the preferred approach. However, there were also people who thought that it would be better to bring all the agencies around one table and flesh out the issues as early as possible and issue a one-stop type of permission with everything in order. So there were two different approaches, slightly conflicting approaches that were happening there. Again, the one-stop shop came up a few times, but the theme there was to be able to grant a permission within a few months, really quickly, and it was also raised that financial concessions, if those could be granted very quickly, that would be great too. And I know that has nothing to do with the planning system per se, but that was viewed as very important for investment into Barbados, because there's no point getting planning permission and then can't get financial concessions for 2 years, you know. Yeah. The use of private sector professionals for certain types of approvals or certification, that came up. Because that could speed up the process. Approving simple houses very quickly. It was suggested that houses could even be approved in the same day, which was an interesting concept. One person suggested that they could have a day in town planning where you just bring your house plans, it gets reviewed one time and gets a stamp same day.
SLA.
Easy so. Instead of even SLA.
What provides SLA? Can only be done with SLA. The current construct.
Correct. So the point is, though, they would like to change that construct.
Yeah.
Also, the consideration that decisions might be made by a board or committee instead of by the chief town planner. They thought that might be a more transparent approach. And that was the summary. There were, as I said, there were over 40 points, but those were the key ones that were big picture items. Thank you.
Okay, don't move from the mic. Any interventions on the floor from Mr. Gill? Okay, thank you, Andy.
Thanks.
Just one thing. The idea, going back to the top of the question, in your own personal assessment and other planners here, should we be moving to development management as a thinking, or have we outlived the time for development control? Are we like the West Indies Cricket Board of Control who to drop the term control and just does that management focus now evoke in us a new thinking that we should have going through the proposed legislation, a new thinking? Because we can end up with the same new legislation but still have a control system. Maybe we already need management with all the other aspects of that would bring, all the transparency, the other things. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I absolutely agree that the word management triggers the right impression in everyone's mind. And in this new age of customer service and customer-centric approach, I'm not saying that you grant all permissions, but for sure, I think there's an expectation that things are done differently and managed at a different level.
Thank you, Andy. The final report is Development Planning and the Physical Development System, the Honorable Clifton Ford is giving that report. Not in terms of his status in Parliament or anything like that. That's just what he is.
Honourable Prime Minister, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Lord, thank you. What came out of our four groups is generally that the 5 years, it was mooted that the 5 years for the physical development plan was considered short, and the life of it, rather than 10 years, some suggestions said they should probably move 12, 15. And there was also concern about certain data feeding into the development plan. And one of those would have been the census, because the cycle of the development plan and the census is sometimes out of sync. There was also the question of having all the data with all the government agencies that collect data that feed into the plan, to have it synchronized so that information is shared across the board, so that the PDP would be given that sort of the information at the same time. Now, there was also thought of reforming land use, and that there should be large densities within Bridgetown. The densities should remain high to try and get people back into Bridgetown. And there was also the question of bringing policies to bring vacant lands and rundown properties into use. And government should sometimes lead by example by renting and leasing the lands under their control. So that was basically the thoughts that came out of the, and no, there's one other. one that I would like to mention that came out is that we should be having a vision for Barbados for the next 20 years so we know where we are going. And it did not necessarily went for zoning as an option, but a marriage of some designation for land use and strategic plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Don't move yet. Are there any interventions from the floor from Mr. Ford or the other facilitators on the topic of development plan and the physical development plan? No issues relating to use? I think there's one intervention coming from a colleague here.
I don't know if this is correct to bring out in development planning, right? But I was suggesting that town planning could be combined with agriculture and land tax.
Okay, that's interesting.
No. The point came up that only one structure is allowed on a 5-acre lot. Okay. But driving through the countryside, there's a lot of unused land and good agricultural farmland. Barbadians seem not to be farmers. At least some Barbadians, or the majority of Barbadians. The people who bought 5-acre lots might not necessarily have been farmers. So the suggestion was that you could allow another property on a 5-acre lot where you have the agriculture workers or agricultural persons living on the 5-acre lot and producing. Because the owner may not be a farmer, he might be one of the members of the professions who had the money to buy a 5-acre lot and have a long, big spread.
You're streamlining another major issue which has to come out in the plan,
but
and some other things, because it has to do with the measures by the way we do land management by means of subdivision. Already, if you have an agricultural lot, you're allowed to 10,000 square foot of curtilage to utilize for house and ancillary buildings. So if you had a workers' quarters, that could also become accommodated. I think the issue of not using land or land being in fallow, as a planner might work the town plan, you'd like to say in hearings, that land is in fallow, is a different issue to do with actual agricultural production, which requires a particular intervention from another ministry to encourage people to use land in a particular way that would be beneficial to the country and themselves as agriculture as a business. So we're seeing those options now. But in terms of, I level up to the floor, combining that in that sense, I think there may be two different ministries going forward.
It might be, but agriculture is a business that should be practiced for profit.
Yes, once they're
and the people who own the agricultural lands, some of them may know that and some may not.
Yes, but persons...
But you have a big 5-acre lot with one house.
Yes, but persons...
And the labor that is working there, he has to travel from wherever he's living to come to work at probably 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock when the sun is hot.
Yes,
but if he lives on the land, he can start at 5 o'clock.
Yes, what I'm saying to you is that the construct already allows for you to have ancillary buildings for workers. People's persons might not know that. The other point is that we may or may not be intervening on another issue that we need to thresh out as to the mechanism used for subdivisions and the size of the lots we create, which is a discussion further down the road. But I want to revert to Mr. Ford on a matter that I want to raise with him quickly. Okay. Yeah. Mr. Ford, just on your point of consistency and clarity, did the issue come up in the discussions through the group that persons were concerned with how the town planning department uses the PDP? Because sometimes people are saying that you use the PDP, very loosely when it suits yourself and very stringently when you want to prove a different point. Is the issue of consistency and clarity going forward one that we need to look at closely? You know, I always say to you and other planners that the chief town planner should be guided by his own guidance.
Well, a lot of discussion didn't come in on that area in particular. However, the question of consistency and clarity has always something that we would want to have on top of the table. But it is not one that actually came up in any big manner.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Selby, I think you have an intervention, please, sir.
Good evening. I think a point that was made consistently in our group was the importance of investor confidence, and that Barbados can't afford to lose good investment. And I don't think I heard any of the leaders mention this a while ago in the discussion. And we know that investment opportunities have been lost because of lack of clarity and lack of decision making in a timely manner. So I think that is very important in terms of development for Barbados. And that was in fact discussed.
Thank you, Mr. Selby. I think that's a very important point, because the idea that, especially with the physical development plan, that it is a document that you can pull from it if you're in England or any part of the world and read it with a degree of confidence that if you make an application according to the guidelines or the policies, that it should be approved. And I think one of the things we may have to discuss going forward in the development management system is what really is the philosophical default position of planning. I personally think that a philosophical default position of planning should be an approval. I think we should start with that idea in the head that our development should go forward, and then for compelling reasons work the other way if it can't work, so that there's a level of confidence in the system that, hey, we are doing things to move the cycle forward. That's why I prefer development management, that you're looking to move it forward, but we can have those discussions later on in the future. Mr. Headley, thank you.
Is Coastal here?
Yes, Coastal is here as well. I think Fabian is here.
Okay, because I'm interested in seeing to what extent the interplay between coastal and town planning is causing delays as well, and if not, I'd be happy to hear. But the truth is that a lot of the investor confidence issues, I think, comes from the interdepartmental coastal agriculture, transport, all of the various drainage. And what I have asked for, and I think the acting chief town planner and PS Public Works I just spoke to during the break, is that we look at the breakdown of processes and seek to create a virtual private network, even without prejudice to the development of the legislation, that will allow for a more seamless consultation process. And the meetings which I propose to start from next Monday, which will have public sector projects 1 week, private sector projects of scale the next week, that we start, so that when people come to the meeting and with the virtual private network, that the source documents are shared and people's comments can then be uploaded within the 14-day period, such that we're not spending the majority of time trying to trace them down in registries. And if we can do that, even without prejudice to what we're doing for new legislation, I would like to believe that it will expedite the process and bring some level of greater investment confidence at the very time that the country needs it. Okay?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mr. Headley?
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We have just about come to the end of this first stakeholder consultation on the amendment to the town planning legislation. As the Prime Minister will have just mentioned, I think Dr. Aline mentioned it as well, planning is very much multi-sectoral, and I don't think, and I think you will agree as well too, that all of that decision-making power needs to, even if it's within one agency, the process needs to be engaging, and it needs to incorporate other agencies as well too, but also those persons, yourselves, stakeholders with and interest groups in the planning and developmental system. At this point, I would ask our Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Defense and Security in the Prime Minister's Office, Mr. Timothy Maynard, to give the closing remarks.
Good evening again, Prime Minister. Good evening, everyone.
The program says closing remarks, but we had such a fruitful discussion today that I'm sure there are no other remarks that you would wish to hear at this time. It is my pleasant duty, therefore, to express appreciation and thanks to everyone for attending this session. I think that it has been worthwhile, but I just want to remind you that we have a second stakeholder consultation next week, Wednesday, commencing again at 2, hopefully in this same room. And also to feel free to continue to submit all of your comments. So far we've had many comments that are being maintained at the Town Planning Department through the servers, but feel free to continue. This is, as the PM said this morning, this exercise goes down to around September. We hope to conclude the draft legislation by November.
No, my dear. Bring forward. This consultation finishes at the end of August, and we hope to have legislation before Parliament in October. So, believe you me, November is a really outer limit because we had a storm. And let's hope we don't.
Right, so you have the clarity. Now, so first of all, let me thank the Prime Minister again for that discussion this morning. That I think it was extremely thorough, comprehensive, put us on the right path in relation to transparency, efficiency, and good governance in the management of the legislation. Minister Duguid, who was here and is not here, I want to thank him also for coming, as well as Ambassador Dame Billy. This could not have been successful without the solid presentations of all of the presenters from the Barbados Town Planning Society, as well as the public sector, the Acting Chief Town Planner, the Ms. Christine Toppin-Alahar. We mentioned that she was a consultant, but she is a consultant in her own right, just not in relation to this as yet, but we hope that we can continue to co-opt her services as necessary. The facilitators were outstanding. All of them were very able professionals. Dr. Yolanda Aline, Mr. George Brown, the Acting Chief Town Planner, the Penfolds, Mr. Kim Penfold, and somewhere in the audience, Ms. Sandy Penfold, who has been as busy as a bee. She was extremely resourceful. She and her team from the Town Planning Society, Jason Dean, Joy Best from the UDC, in helping us to plan this event at very short notice. I also want to thank Mr. Lord in relation to the way that he guided the plenary discussion, as well as other members of the Barbados Town Planning Society. And finally, to the staff of the LESC for providing these fine facilities. But I don't want to part without endorsing the Prime Minister's comment this morning that we don't have the luxury of time in relation to the completion of this process. And she rapped me on my knuckles just now again when she said the process has to be brought up to October. If planning is to be a critical component in the management of our economic and social program, then we all have to do the best that we can to make sure that it goes forward. And for one, I will be calling upon each and every one of you again sometime in the very near future to continue to assist us with this process. So I know that we're all anxious to go and do our secondary chores right now. So without any further ado, and Mr. MC, I haven't forgotten you. Thank you for steering the process this morning. So to everybody, thank you again and have a very good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. Get home safely.